This is the story of American freedom. So the Lone Star State added its own history to the story of America and the story of freedom in America. And the brave republic struggled on for 10 more years until 1846. But it had always been the plan of Andrew Jackson and of Sam Houston that it would be annexed to the United States. And so it was done. One of the greatest and most underrated presidents in American history, James Polk, managed to get us into just the right war with Mexico. He was a strong Jackson Democrat, believed in the ordinary American, democratic freedom, equality, and was determined to see this vision of democratic freedom and equality spread over the entire continent. It was, in the view of most at the time, a short and glorious war. Mexico was not a weak little republic, remember. It was an empire stretching from what we call Mexico all the way up to New Mexico, Arizona, California, Utah, Nevada, the southern part of Colorado, with a veteran army. But they were defeated. Men like Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant fighting side by side. And the peace treaty awarded America a new empire. We had already seized California during the war, and now we stretched all across that vast portion of North America that had once been part of Mexico. There were celebrations and joy. And then we added to that, also under James K. Polk, Oregon and Washington. The British disputed our claim. Well, having seen the prowess of the American army, they decided to come to terms with us. And so there, without even firing a shot, another empire was gained for this empire of liberty. But there were those who were bitterly opposed to the Mexican War. They saw it in that war nothing but another means of expanding the territory of slavery. And the issue became ever more pressing. Could slavery spread into these new territories? Now, by 1846, slavery was not a dying institution. Slavery was thriving. Slavery seemed to be the wave of the future. In fact, slaves were being used in factories. States like Missouri, and indeed towns like Richmond and Atlanta. Slaves could be used in mines. They could be used to farm great ranches out in this new Southwest lands. So slavery was thriving. The price of a slave was at an all-time high. And there were those who became convinced that the South did not want tolerance for slavery, that the South would not rest until this was a slave empire. And Southerners dreamt of a tropic empire, even of an alliance with the slave-holding nation of Brazil. And ultimately, as Abraham Lincoln said, a house divided against itself could not stand. He did not expect it to fall, but he did expect it to cease to be divided. Lincoln had been one of those strong opponents of the Mexican War. His election in 1860 was one of the most critical in American history. bitterly fought over. The new party, the Republican Party, not only was opposed to slavery, but also promised entitlements to the American people. Vote Republican and vote yourself a farm. They made deals with the business interest and railroad interest to give away vast tracts of land for a transcontinental railroad. Then the Democratic Party bitterly split. One candidate was for slavery, another was opposed to slavery, and the third said, let's just kick the can down the road and see what happens. Now, you must understand one thing. Today, we know that slavery is a great evil. It is abhorrent to every value we hold. But in 1860, there was a different set of moral values in the South. A Southerner, if you were to come down to, let us say, the University of Georgia from Harvard, preaching an abolitionist doctrine, well, first of all, you probably wouldn't be allowed to preach it. There was not much freedom of speech about slavery. But nonetheless, that Southerner would tell you, first of all, slavery is constitutional. It is there in the Constitution that if a slave runs away to a free state, federal marshals must bring him back. And then, why is it immoral? What is the next paragraph after you talk about the Ten Commandments? What follows the tenth commandment? And it is about how to deal with a Hebrew slave. So Yahweh did not condemn slavery. Paul wrote a letter to Philemon in which he said that you should be a good slave and that a master should be just. Cicero and Aristotle, two of Jefferson's sources for the Declaration of Independence, said that slavery was part of the natural order of the human race. So that Southerner would have said to you, who are you, Mr. Massachusetts abolitionist, coming down here telling me that you're smarter than Moses, Paul, Aristotle, and Cicero, all rolled up into one. Moreover, our Constitution is founded on the fundamental right to property. I don't know whether they taught you to read Cicero at Harvard, but there he says the very foundation of morality is a belief in private property. Now, we today know this is wrong, evil. But to Southerners, slaves were their property. And they had the right, as they saw it, to take those slaves anywhere they wanted to, into any territory. And Lincoln, when he was inaugurated amidst threats of assassination in 1861, gave a very feeble inaugural address, making it seem that he was weak and would not respond to any attack upon federal property. Now, you talk about a polarizing president. Before he was inaugurated, 7 states had already left the Union, and 4 more would join them after the firing upon Fort Sumter and his calling out of 75,000 volunteers. The war came, and like so many wars, it was believed it would be short and glorious, but it wasn't. Manassas was not followed by a federal capitulation, and the war dragged on and on and on. And so we come to May the 1st, 1863, Go back with me to a second growth forest called the wilderness. And you are not you, but you are a soldier in the Army of the Potomac. You're fishermen from Maine and lumberjacks from Minnesota and farmers from Illinois. You're good soldiers. You're well equipped, far better equipped than the rebels. But they keep beating you again and again because even though your army is much larger and better equipped, you cannot find, your commander-in-chief, Abraham Lincoln, cannot find a suitable general. You've gone through one bad general after another, and now you have another. Joseph Hooker. Even his nickname is a fraud, Fighting Joe Hooker. In fact, the newspaper headline, it simply read, Fighting Joe Hooker. That is to say, he's engaged in a battle. But he uses it proudly. His moral values are a little lax. His headquarters is compared to a combination of a bar and a bordello. Did you ever hear of the term hooker for ladies of light love? Well, that comes directly from Joe Hooker. But this time, this ambitious general who has been scheming for command of the Army of the Potomac, he has old Robert E. Lee trapped. He has the old Fox trapped. Hooker has an army of 120,000 men. Estimates give Lee no more than 60,000 men. Some of them are holding the town of Fredericksburg, 9 miles from this wilderness. But that night, on May the 1st, General Robert E. Lee, command of the Army of Northern Virginia, calls his brilliant second in command, Thomas J. Jackson, Stonewall Jackson. His wife does not like that name. It sounds too harsh. And he's a loving man, a Bible-reading man. And reading that Bible, he has come to see the South, the Confederate States of America, as a new Israel. And he must drive the Union, the Amalekites, from the sacred soil of the South. Lee calls Jackson to him and says, I have information that the Union flank is suspended. That is to say, in military terms, hanging up in the air with no natural barrier like a creek or a river to support it. How many men would you need to get around and attack that flank tomorrow as early as possible? Jackson says 23,000 men. Lee gulps. This will leave him with no more than 17,000 men to face General Hooker and his 120,000 men should Hooker unleash an attack. Go ahead, says Lee. A Baptist minister's son is found who can guide them through the 12 miles of backwood paths. I've walked those with my students. Many of the students, particularly the girls, take off their shoes so they can walk barefoot, just the way the Confederate soldiers did. But it's a task to move 23,000 men and their cannons, and Jackson has hoped to arrive by about noon. But in fact, it's growing on towards 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And Jackson's worried. Will he have enough time, even if his attack is successful, to destroy the Union flank? But gradually, his army goes into position, silently there in that forest, opposite you, the 11th Corps of the Union Army. You know nothing about it. You are, many of you, recent immigrants. You come from Germany. You think everything's going to be quiet tonight. Getting ready to fix your little dinner. You've got your weapons all neatly stacked. And you still speak to each other in German. Tja, was machst du da für Abendessen? Ja, das ist ein Lebenschaos. Das soll ein Lebenschaos? Ich mache das Abendessen. Du wasche die Geschirr. You wash the dishes. I'm going to fix supper. And then, oh, was für einen schönen Reh. Look at that beautiful deer come bounding out of the woods. Oh, so viele schöne Vögel. Look at all those birds coming out of there. Halt's mal. Hier stimmt was nicht. Shut up. Something's wrong here. And suddenly, coming out of that forest, cannons roaring, rifles and muskets firing, come those Confederate soldiers. Ah! Pour it into them, boys. Shoot down those foreign trash. Kill them. Kill every one of those Yankee sons of bitches. And so begins the famous rout. Joe Hooker is so drunk that afternoon that the first even knows about this. Oh, he's been warned by some of his reconnaissance units, but he's like a typical CEO. He only listens to the information he wants to hear. So the first thing he really knows about it is when this corps comes running through his front yard. Then it is said a cannonball landed on his headquarters in the Chancellor House, from which the name Chancellorsville, and he's knocked out for most of the rest of the battle. In fact, I think he was lying there dead drunk. But either way, his army is in total rout. But it's gotten late. 8 o'clock comes, the night begins to fall, and Jackson is worried that he's not going to be able to pursue his assault. So he rides out with just a few officers. He comes upon a contingent of troops from North Carolina. Only a few minutes before, they have been ridden over by Pennsylvania cavalry, so they are naturally a little suspicious. And they fire. Stop shooting, you fools. You've shot your own men. You've shot General Jackson. And Jackson will be wounded and then ultimately die of that wound. When Lee is brought the news, he says, "Don't speak to me of it. It is too painful." But he then appoints J.E.B. Stuart, known as a cavalry commander, but he assumes the duties of an infantry commander this next day. And all through the next day, they continue to roll up the Yankee Army, the Union Army. And late that afternoon, Robert E. Lee rides through the courtyard of the Chancellor Plantation. And there are his soldiers, many of them in rags, their faces all blackened. For this is a dry season, and many of the woods have caught on fire, and some men have died, burned to death, unable to move because of their wounds. But his men are there to greet him, and they shout out as he rides through on his horse Traveler, "Lee, Lee, 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 Lee." And a British observer noted, "Watching that scene, I now realize why the ancients raised their great generals to the rank of gods." There's also a long line of Union prisoners. Whenever Lee meets an enlisted man, he takes off his hat as a sign of the highest tribute. The Union prisoners began to jostle each other. "That's so Lee, that's Lee." And then one of them steps forward and says, "I'd give anything if you were ours." And with tears in his eye, Lee takes off his hat to that Union prisoner and all those Union boys. He would have given anything in the world not to be there fighting fellow Americans. I want no other anthem than Hail Columbia. I want no other country than the United States of America. There is nothing I would not give up to preserve the Union except liberty and honor. For Lee, like the rest of the Confederates, believed that they were following in exactly the same path as their forefathers, who had broken with their mother country to have liberty. Lee's father had been one of the foremost commanders in the Revolutionary War, Light Horse Harry Lee. And a glorious future lay before Light Horse Harry Lee. But then he lost his money speculating in Western lands, and Robert E. Lee's first memory was the sheriff coming to take their plantation. It should be remembered that this soldier, Robert E. Lee, who fought so gallantly for the Confederacy, never owned a single square foot of land in Virginia, never owned a single slave. He believed that slavery was morally wrong, but to allow the federal government to abolish it would be to establish a centralized federal government that would be fiscally irresponsible and seek to control every aspect of the individual's life. When time came for him to go to college, the only place his mother could afford was West Point. And there, with glowing letters of recommendation, he graduated with high honors and went on to serve in the Corps of Engineers and then served with the greatest distinction in the Mexican War. His mentor, Winfield Scott, raised a toast in the halls of Montezuma. To the officer we owe most to, Robert E. Lee. But the crisis over secession grew ever deeper. When the April came of 1861, Lee was at his wife's home, Arlington. That was not Lee's home, it was his wife's home, taking care of his father-in-law's estate. He received word to cross the Potomac and meet with his old mentor, Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott came quickly to the point. "Lee, I have orders from the President to offer you command of all field armies of the United States," jumping him in rank over many other generals. Lee at this time was still far from even being a general. But Lee said no. Winfield Scott stood up, said, "Lee, you are making the biggest mistake of your life." But I knew it would be so. Lee then offered his services to his state of Virginia. And then on June the 1st, 1862, he took command of the Army of Northern Virginia. And he led it to a series of victories that would resound forever through military history, like Second Manassas, the drawn Battle of Sharpsburg, Antietam, the great victory at Fredericksburg, and now Chancellorsville. He was ranked in the North and in Europe as the greatest general of his day. equal to Julius Caesar and Napoleon. Thus it was when Stonewall Jackson was laid to rest in Lexington. Lee was not there. None of the members of the Confederate cabinet were there. They were in the Confederate White House, listening to Robert E. Lee sketch out a bold plan. The only hope for the Confederacy was recognition by Britain and France and the financial support that would bring. And Lee sketched how he would march his army into Union territory, capture the state capital of Pennsylvania at Harrisburg, force the Union Army to come to him fortified on the heights, destroy them, and then march upon Washington. The British cabinet was awaiting news of such a great victory on Union soil. So was the Emperor of the French, Napoleon III. And so it was in a driving rainstorm that Lee led his men across the Potomac, carrying in his vest a letter from Jefferson Davis to be laid upon the desk of Abraham Lincoln, dictating terms for the recognition of the independence of the Southern Confederacy. Hardly less remarkable than the general who led them was this army of Northern Virginia, this army of cavaliers and crackers who for 4 long years carried the cause of Southern independence upon their bayonets. We could literally smell the rebel army coming before we saw them, said one observer in Pennsylvania. They were a most ragged and hungry pack of wolves. No two of them had a uniform alike. The only thing clean about them were their guns and their teeth from a constant diet of corn on the cob and apples. And yet somehow they carried themselves with a panache, lacking in our far better equipped Union soldiers. So they came to Gettysburg. It was not the battle of Lee's choosing, but the enemy is there, and there we will strike him. Honor demands it. Honor. The first day, these first days of July, and on the first day, the Confederate Army almost cracked the Union line. But the Union line held the heights, well fortified. And now, under a new general, General Meade, George Meade, he is a most capable officer, said Lee. He will not make a mistake, and if I make one, he will take the utmost advantage of it. The second day, again, the Union line almost cracked, but it held firm. And so on the third day, 17,000 troops, most of them fresh. Lee carried out the plan that he had read about in the papers that had resulted in the great French and Italian victory at Solferino against the Austrians. A heavy bombardment beginning at 1:06 in the afternoon, stopping precisely at 3:06, and then those 17,000 men stepped across. Proudly, boldly, but the great Union cannons began to rip their ranks, and then the fire from the Union rifles, until only a handful were left to reach the stone wall that had been Lee's objective. They fell back, shattered. Now, if this happened today, a general would be looking for somebody way down on the totem pole to blame, not Lee. He wrote out and said, "It's all my fault, boys. It's all my fault. I've got us in a terrible mess, and you've got to help me get us out." The next day, July the 4th, Lee waited for a counterattack that never came. July the 4th. The Confederates believed they were following in the path of George Washington. What is on the seal of the Confederate States of America? It is George Washington. And under it, the legend, Deo Vindice, God will vindicate us. But on this 4th of July, in a pouring rain, Lee began his retreat back to Virginia. And on that same day, the great port city of the Confederacy, Vicksburg, the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. And the long road down to Appomattox began. On Palm Sunday of 1865, Lee went to meet with Grant in a small little hamlet, Appomattox Courthouse. Lee was resplendent in his dress uniform, but he said, "I would rather die 1,000 deaths." But Grant, with enormous magnanimity, granted very easy terms. Let the Confederate soldiers give their word that they would no longer take up arms against the United States, and they could go home on their parole. He also gave rations to the starving Confederate army. But Lee, as he'd kept his composure all during these negotiations, when he stepped out of the little parlor, thinking no one was watching him, his neck turned beet red. And then when he got on his horse, Traveler, he petted that beautiful animal and said, "Oh," and then came to himself and rode out of the courtyard. "We're watching history being made," said an aide to Grant. Grant didn't answer. He just took off his hat. And every officer and every man in that courtyard took off their hat to Robert E. Lee. Many of his soldiers were urging a guerrilla war, but Lee said, "No, that will tear apart our nation for generations to come." There flies again the flag of the United States. Serve it as you serve the flag of the Confederacy, and all will be right. What magnanimity, what an epoch in the story of American freedom. No other nation in history would have been so magnanimous as to give such easy terms to the end of a civil war in which 623,026 men had died. That is more than all the men we have lost in all the wars we have fought. Lee would go on to become president of what is now Washington and Lee College, transform that institution, show himself a bold educator, instituting courses in business. But the war was never far from his mind. His health was weak. His heart was weak. When he would go on his afternoon rides with travelers, his old friend, a doctor, would go with him. And once, Lee suddenly stopped and pounded. If I had only been properly supported that third day at Gettysburg, we would have won. "Forgive me," he said, I never speak of the war, but it never leaves my mind. He served on the board of his church. One Sunday, as the congregation got ready to go down and kneel, they suddenly froze in their seats. A black man had gone down to kneel to take communion. No one would move. Lee got up from his seat and knelt beside him. For as the governor of Virginia said to his son, if General Lee says something is right, then it is right. In October of 1870, he suffered a stroke. His daughter described how in his final hours, Papa's mind drifted back to the scenes of that awful war, those terrible battles. Tell A.P. Hill that he must move forward. I ordered fire to be put on that position. Where is General Stuart? And then a look of complete calm came over his face, and he uttered the words that were always his hallmark when the Army of Northern Virginia would start out on campaign. Strike the tent. Robert E. Lee died thinking himself a failure. Far greater failure than his father, who had ruined only himself. Lee believed that he had ruined his country. But sometimes we're not the best judge of how well we've succeeded in life. Robert E. Lee avoided the easy path to worldly fame and fortune by commanding the United States armies. He chose instead to follow his ideal of honor. And he followed that ideal of honor to greatness.
The Story of Freedom in America with Dr. J. Rufus Fears is made possible by the generous support of our Freedom and Heritage sponsors. The Story of Freedom in America is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma, in partnership with the Alumni Association of the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.